Hi, I'm Ikea, and for today's video, I want to have an in-depth look into the Beacon exotic chest. This new exotic for Year 7 Season 3 is actually pretty interesting, as it is a group-wide buff that is based on having some more damage, but also having some more skill efficiency, which could translate into a little bit of damage, and some regen to go with it. All tied together in a chess piece that requires you to be close to your allies. And that might be actually the part that is hardest to do with this. But we'll look at that when we get there. This will be all timestamped so you can jump around. There'll be several chapters underneath here as we'll go over how to get it and then what it does. And then jump into some calculations. They'll be primarily focused on the damage side of things, but it does more than just damage. And that's actually important to keep in mind as we go through here. And then we'll take it actually into some gameplay, show kind of how it does or does not work out, and then reach a conclusion. So yeah, let's go get started. And let's start out by looking at where we get the beacon from, as this beacon comes from the season track for this season, and it is at level 29, so pretty early in it. Together with getting the beacon, when you claim this, you also get the blueprint for it to reconfigure it. It only comes with the stats that it has, the red core plus crit chance crit damage. It doesn't reconfigure into anything else, but at least sometimes it can be worthwhile to, if it comes with way low stats, to maybe take a chance, re-roll it once, maybe you get some better stats out of it, as I did actually, as the first one that I got would have taken quite a bit of optimization, and the second, just a re-roll, helped out a little bit. You only get a 1 from this season. It isn't in the target loot pools. You cannot receive more of them from either targeted or exotic caches or such, and most likely that will be the case, as it has been for the last few seasons with exotics like the overdogs and such, where we won't get a chance at a second one until the stretch goals, which is a system I'm not per se too happy about. I would think that in the past, in the long past at this point, because several seasons, at this point 5-6 seasons, this hasn't been the case. Once you got it once from the season track, then it would start being in your exotic loot pool, and you could get it from targeted loot or from exotic caches. For the last 5 or so seasons, this hasn't been the case, even though still people say that. In this case, again, like last season's Overdogs, this isn't in targeted loot at all. And for instance as well, it won't, for this season, Overdogs went into the retaliation blueprint pool, and we can, for instance, get Shroud and Overdogs from just the retaliation system. That'll likely be the case here again. But yeah, watch out with the one that you get, because you basically only get one until the end of the season. Make sure to favorite it and just hang on to it, as yeah, they are actually somewhat rare because of that. And then just quickly looks-wise, as we have it on the character model here, it looks like an ballistic vest that has seen better times. It has been hit a few times here and there, and somebody is just muddying around with some electronics here, likely to buff our allies. It is actually an unique item from the looks perspective, as all exotics often are, but it's a pretty bland one and nothing too interesting here. And then looking at what the beacon can mean for us, as its flavor text, it has a with me, as yeah, that is the thing we do want allies to do, to stick with us and, you know, be close. It always comes with a red core, crit chance, crit damage as its stats, a mod slot, of course, available there. And as its talent is the talent Bond, James Bond. Both you and allies receive plus 30% crit damage, plus 15 skill efficiency, and plus 2% armor regen when an ally is within 10 meters of you. Then there's also receive 15 crit damage, 8% skill efficiency, and 1% armor regen when one of your skills is within 10 meters of you. And only the highest group of buffs can be active at one time. So one is based on ally, and of course this season's companion counts for this. Your teammates, if you're running in a group, will count for this, but even actually NPCs out in the world just by themselves will count for this as well, as they often trigger as the same way, for instance, that companion does. basically anything that would trigger companion triggers this ally. Then also, when one of your skills is within 10 meters of you, you basically get half of the stats that you would if an ally is within range. So if you're running this solo without a companion, for instance, in future seasons, and you're just using a skill, you basically get half of the value out of it. The skill, of course, is much more controllable to be near you, especially if you take, for instance, an healing drone that can follow you around and stay within 10 meters, where, of course, with allies, this 10 meters is, I'll give away already, kind of the biggest hurdles we have to get through here. It is well doable in coordinated teams, and especially if you are on comms with allies. But especially, of course, if we think of just match-made groups, yeah, everybody's just running around like a headless chicken and trying to herd cats, quite almost literally, is a challenge sometimes. Only, as it says here, the highest group of buffs can be active at one time. So meaning that basically if you have an ally nearby, this will be active. If you don't have an ally nearby, but you do have a skill, then this one will be active. And otherwise, nothing will. And this is also, at the time of this video, when you see it, a little bit of an issue, as this isn't true, at least not in this way, because you can stack it for multiple people. Throughout this video, we won't actually be considering it in that way. I think that isn't intended. We'll have to see over time if they actually fix it, because also even with intentions or not, it depends on if they fix it as well, if it's intended to be different. But currently, multiple people running this will apply the buffs to each other, and you can basically stack it. And because of that, you get a runaway effect when you have, for instance, 4 of them in a group. But I don't think that is intended, because especially things like 8% armor regen is a bit much to be able to be gotten. And because of that, we'll be looking at it in here just in the way that I think it is intended, that in the same way as, for instance, a coyote, if you have multiple coyotes, if they are in the same range, well, you can have separate ranges active at one time. You can't have, for instance, 3 mid-range buffs at the same time. With this as well, I think it is intended to just have one of these at most. And yeah, because of that, we'll be looking at it in that way. And yeah, that skill as well, it is important to note that deployed skills and such will count for this. In-world item skills will count for this, like Firefly and drones and such. Firefly very briefly, of course, as it will get away from you pretty quick. But things like shield and handheld skills will not count for this. So you can't just have this bonus up just by having a shield out. And just to show its buffs and such on the buff bar, here we see the icon for it. This icon as well will be actually above my character. So in the same way that, for instance, when you see a different player running things like Tinkerer or such, where you see the icon above their head out in the open world, you will see the players that are running Beacon marked by that. And then when we get out of range, as I've recruited this double ganger to kind of stand in there for us, if we get out of range, the icon disappears. When we get back in range again, it reappears. And it is that 10 meters, as we can kind of check here with the grenade distance indicator, even though that isn't perfect, but close enough. And of course, we can trigger it also with the skills. Now here, just deploying a hive like I have here, that will actually trigger it. Now, of course, the skill side of things is basically half of those stats, and that's not per se worth it. Trying to make it work alongside of a turret drone or something wouldn't really be the way to use this. I feel this is definitely a group running exercise. Now, there is no separate icon for when it is an ally or a skill. So for instance, if I get close to my ally, it doesn't change in any way. So making it hard to tell if it is your skill or if it is an ally. Now, of course, if I'm running, I don't have my hive deployed and my pulse is not, even though, for instance, if I activate my pulse, that wouldn't trigger the beacon. Of course, that doesn't have, the pulse does not put something out in the open world, except for the remote pulse. That distance is really the limiting factor here, because while we can get a decent part apart, just being in 10 meters is not something that honestly naturally really happens, especially in just general gameplay and, for instance, match-made gameplay or something. I find myself kind of separating out from the pack, usually if like 2 people already go this way, I'll go that other way just to cover that side if I know the respawn's going to happen there or such. And really the limiting factor will always be that distance. It is just distance. So for instance, in a minute, we'll look as well at Overwatch, for instance, as a way of buffing allies. Now with Overwatch, of course, we would need to be in cover and such. Here we just need to be close to each other. Thing to remember as well is that when we are out of range and don't have a skill deployed, it's basically completely inactive. There isn't an participation prize for just wearing it just by itself. And yeah, it does hurt quite a bit when you try to keep up with your allies, but they just keep running away from you. Now, of course, in coordinated teams and in some such situations, we can, of course, make sure that we are all together and that the buff is active on everybody. And let's start moving it to some calculations. Here we have a trio of multi-calculators set up. As we'll be looking over the beacon here, mostly what it will trade off when we put this into a build and how much do you lose on the build itself. Then we'll look actually at how much it provides to other builds and basically your teammates, if they are running. In this case, we'll take Striker as just, you know, the stand-in for that, both in chest form and in its basic form, and especially as well looking at it compared to Overwatch, which is one of the other things we can take in the chest slot, similar way, but then as well actually not an exotic, so we can have different exotics there. And then we really need to look at it from a group perspective as well. And here, of course, we're kind of looking at it in perfect output and such. That's, of course, in general gameplay, not often going to happen. But here we're dealing with theoreticals, of course. And for those not familiar with these are multi-calculators of my design, and the input will happen down here for the build itself, and then we can have the weapon stats up here, a short name for the build, and then what we especially get at is a damage per mag, a burst DPS, and a sustain DPS, so we can compare those in percentage form against each other. And here as well, we'll be looking at it in beacon in multiple ways. Also, for this entire in-depth look, we'll have it at 20% headshot rate, and especially this being a crit damage increase, we'll look at it, of course, with 100% and at 0 as well. But it does make quite a difference because, of course, crit damage and headshot will be pulled together before they multiply against the rest. And, of course, as well, we'll look at it at 60% DTA rate, but actually here, if I remember right, we don't actually make use of that as it's all ARs all the way down. And these multi-calculators is also a video on my channel if you want to go much more in-depth with them. Let's go get started with this first one. And let's start looking at it from the perspective of the player running the beacon. As here what we effectively have is the build as I have it in here, although with a Lexington as the weapon, is a Cheska piece, although we'll be looking at different pieces at that point. 4 pieces of Striker and then beacon instead of whatever chests, although we'll be mostly competing it against the equalizer, as that's the go-to now, of course. And how much would we gain or lose? Now, of course, from a very quick perspective, we can already tell that we're going to lose in the damage sense. But it is important throughout this entire calculation part of this, we're mostly looking at this plus 30% crit damage and how much we gain from that. But there's, of course, 2 other stats here. And honestly, in my opinion, this 2% armor regen is actually the prize. This is actually the thing that will make this worth it in some cases. And the 30% crit damage is kind of a little bit extra on top. But of course, yeah, from a damage perspective, that is the one that we'll be looking at in the weapon damage end of things. We're also getting 15% skill efficiency, and especially this as well for things like the skill health that it provides for shields and such can actually be impactful. And of course, the skill haste that this provides to everybody will make everybody's skills come back quite a bit faster. And all of that does require then, though, that that ally be within 10 meters of us, and that's actually then really the biggest downside of this. And none of that is really shown within these calculations. We're going to perform them as if we are basically always going to be in range of allies and such, and not per se looking at it from that perspective. So do keep that in mind as we'll come back to actually looking at it holistically within the gameplay. But from a damage perspective, that 30% crit damage, we basically have that on. We can also set it to the skill, and we will in a second. But if we are taking Beacon plus Cheska, or Beacon plus Unit, or Beacon plus Salvo, because we can lay it out in different ways, of course. And the reason as well that I was wearing Cheska there is actually that the Cheska, especially on the sustain end of things as well, does quite a bit better. On the burst, it is close to equal. But then this is, for instance, if I was running Killer, this is before Killer activates. And of course, Killer will add to the crit chance, crit damage side of things. And that will make it so that the Cheska actually falls behind, in this case, behind the Salvo by a tiny bit. So it does kind of depend on which talents we are running, because for instance, instead, if we're running Streamline, then Cheska would stay on top. But the Cheska, especially, even with Killer on, the sustain differences and the damage per mag differences are still there. And because of that, I would lean towards, for instance, if we're min-maxing for having a Beacon in there, and then what piece do we take? I would take a Cheska there. Putting Killer back off for now for a second, just so we have the base again. Here we have just strikers with just an equalizer plus a unit and an equalizer plus Cheska. Well, from the unit in-depth look, we already know the equalizer plus unit is actually going to beat the equalizer plus Cheska as long as it is an AR, and we see that same here. I did include both still though, but yeah, we're really going to look at this equalizer plus unit as kind of a baseline comparison to how much we gain or lose. So with that extra 24 total weapon damage that we would get from the equalizer versus basically that 30 crit damage that we have there from Beacon being active, yeah, there's a 20% difference, and on the sustain end, it's an 18% difference. That's basically what we're giving up for the player that is going to run Beacon, and then, for instance, here in his full striker from a damage perspective. Now, of course, one of the things you can do with Beacon is stick it in more so support kind of builds. It is actually kind of an issue for it that it isn't paired in a way that we could maybe have different stats on it. I wonder in the background if that is possible, but maybe if we had two variants of this, and maybe every time you reconfigure it, you basically get the other one. Because another one with, for instance, having a skill or a skill tier, repair skill haste, would actually find some places to find some use, especially, for instance, in measured assembly and such. Because there we could, for instance, then go with different booster hive instead of a healing hive. Take the smart cover, still have no healing from our skills, but then just, for instance, have the 2% regen from here, making it heal allies. But yeah, it is a red core crit chance, crit damage. That means that, for instance, if we do want to stick it in some other builds, we might lose some stats, or maybe they are already going towards that with, like, for instance, a red FI or such. But if we're looking at it from just the pure perspective of how much damage would we lose if we're just running the Beacon instead of an equalizer, yeah, it is, of course, a pretty big gap. And we see that as well here, actually going from then there's, of course, Overdogs that exist. Now here with Overdogs just all the times 100% active, we even jump up way higher, as we see here. They basically compound together, of course, multiplying towards each other, and then, yeah, we land on a quite higher number. Now, if we're running the equalizer plus Overdogs, we could, of course, say that, yeah, we shouldn't have it at 100% uptime. Let's even make it half uptime, which I feel actually in a lot of situations, you'll be above half uptime on the Overdogs. Even then, that is quite a bit ahead, and that's really why that is kind of the meta that we go for nowadays for just the general build. And then if we're dropping it down to a Beacon, of course, we can't take the Overdogs. We can't take Beacon Overdogs because it is the exotic. It is taking that slot. But then what we could say is that for other talents, we could. So here with Ferocious Calm, which is perfect Overwatch, we could actually go Ferocious Calm for ourselves, and then together with Overdogs for ourselves, and then give, of course, that perfect Overwatch bonus to everybody in the team, and then especially as well without the requirement of range, but with the requirement of staying in cover for the 8 seconds with perfect. Because yeah, Perfect Ferocious Calm, for those maybe unfamiliar, is actually Perfect Overwatch. After staying in cover for 8 seconds with the Perfect 10 seconds with the normal, increase you and your allies' total weapon damage, total weapon and skill damage by 14%. And then for the normal, it is 12%. As long as you remain in cover or in a cover-to-cover move. And the important part as well with Overwatch, we can actually cover-to-cover to move around if need be. But this requires the player themselves to adhere to this and stay in cover and such, but there is no range limitation here. And that's why from a damage perspective, I think actually we would definitely lean more towards Perfect Overwatch. But then again, that's why we had the whole but at the start, the whole disclaimer is that is just from a damage perspective. Now, on the skill efficiency side, if we're just taking that for skill damage as well, then yeah, the total skill damage is going to be worth more. But here, that 2% regen, that's again, here kind of the big prize. Going back to here, yeah, with Ferocious Calm, one of the things we can do as well is just a high-end named beast on the chest slot. We can take Overdogs alongside of it. And that means that even going for the build for the player themselves, just from a damage perspective again, if we take Ferocious Calm plus Overdogs, even at a 50% uptime for the Overdogs, we're still way ahead of the Beacon plus here that Cheska piece. Mostly because Overdogs is kind of OP, but we can go there. And with the Ferocious Calm, we can go there. With the Beacon, we can't at all. And that's kind of a limiting factor from a damage perspective. And then as well, comparing that with normal Overwatch, which would just be harder to keep up with 10%, with 10 seconds needed in cover before it gets going, and then you only get 12% out of it, so it's a weaker buff for your teammates. But of course, taking Fenris with the Ferocious Calm as the brand bonus versus Cheska, we do want to know the differences there, and we see actually that yeah, the Ferocious Calm definitely wins out there and would give the bigger buff. The downside is, of course, Ferocious Calm is a DZ named item, and that means that you can get it from, well, DZ as a drop, but of course from named item caches and several other places nowadays where named items can be from the DZ/PvP pool, like reconstructed caches, and of course you can get the blueprint from reconstructed caches. But still a little bit harder of an item to get than, for instance, just the Beacon for this season, where we can just take it from the reward track. Just briefly as well, we'll swap here from going from Beacon Ally to Beacon from Skill, halving that crit damage that it had, of course, there. By going that route, we see that actually, yeah, now it even pushes further apart between these, as we gain quite a bit on it here, as yeah, of course, halving that to 15 crit damage really does lose us quite a bit. Now, without either of these buffs is of course well not worth it, because if we disable both of them, yeah, then it jumps quite high, of course. But the gain from it can be worth it just from a damage perspective, because it isn't, while it is quite a bit behind, we lose a decent chunk. If we turn it back down to ally here, we lose a decent chunk, but yeah, especially that regen might be worth it for that 20%. Especially consider that we're providing our bonuses as well, group-wide, as long as they're close enough to us. Let's actually go looking at them. And now that we've looked at it from the perspective of the person running it, let's look at it from the perspective of the other people that could be receiving it, as hopefully they are in range. Somebody hopefully is in range. Now, in this case, we're basically taking that same Striker Equalizer plus Overdogs that we had upstairs, and then we're adding in either Beacon. Here we can toggle it as well between skills and ally, and we will in a bit. Overwatch, just a normal Overwatch, and then Perfect Overwatch, just to have those metrics there. And of course, as we said, that 14% total weapon damage, just by how the calculation works out, especially crit, is already pretty populated, giving pretty heavily diminishing returns. That pool is pretty full. Now, in the case of strikers here with Equalizer, we do already have some total weapon damage there as well. So we don't actually get the full returns from total weapon damage either. That also is a pool that is additive from all soldiers and then multiplies against the rest. So that 24 and that 14 and 16, or 12 and 14 will add together to form, this 36 and this 38 before they multiply against the rest. That's also why later on we'll look at it from a chest striker perspective where we don't have any total weapon damage there. Here though, from the beacon being close to us, just from that 30% crit damage, for the striker, at least here first with killer not activated or such, we are getting a 9%, a little closer to 10%, 9.7%. That is actually a decent buff to give to allies. Now, of course, as we saw, the player themselves lost about 20%, even in some of the better scenarios, and even more than that. But we are giving basically 9%, close to 10%, let's say, to our allies. That is, of course, in this case, if they're getting it, they can't be a skill anyway. So, but let's just say if we kind of just want to know that halfway point, the 15, if it's added onto us, it's basically the half of close or a little bit over half of that, because we will be getting, as we're pushing it higher, more diminishing returns. So it is a little bit more than half than if ally is active. But actually, when it applies to this person, well, they need to be in range, so they're an ally, and then that means that we really only need to look at it in that ally form. And what we see here as well, Overwatch and Perfect Overwatch, and especially Perfect Overwatch, because if you're going to run it, this is also kind of to illustrate that, you might as well just run Perfect, because you apply a bigger buff to your allies as well. So here, just because of the additive nature of total weapon damage, the equalizers obliterate is adding together with the Overwatch's bonuses, and we don't get the full 12% out, but we aren't really pushing that stat so high that we're getting heavy diminishing returns on there. It's just a little bit. Instead of 12%, we're getting 11.29% out of it there. And then one of the things is, of course, when we activate Killer as a talent, we're adding even more into that crit damage. What we see is actually that the Overwatches didn't get affected by that, because they won't. They are their own separate multiplier. They're just feeding into that. The build's totals did change, but so did the first one, basically. So in effect, in separation between them, all of those builds went up by the same amount, except for the beacon, because the beacon is feeding into crit damage. And because of that, it's actually getting diminishing returns into that crit damage if we're running, for instance, Killer there. So weapon talents and such will matter as well, what weapon talents your allies are running alongside of you. It would be beneficial for them to, for instance, although, well, the thing is, Killer is still one of the top talents, but for instance, if they're okay running Streamline, Streamline would not be affected by either of these two, so it would basically linearly add its bonuses there. Meaning that between them, as we see here as well, when I'm triggering Streamline on and off, the numbers actually between them don't change at all. And that's, while the base number goes up, everything goes up by basically the same amount. So the percentage difference stays the same. Now, that's also the reason why we're looking at it from a chest striker perspective, as in the chest striker, that Overwatch is going to be its full effect. So for the normal, we see 12%, for the perfect, we see 14%, and that's just because there's no longer, if we're running a chest striker, striker itself, of course, a separate multiplier, even though it does say total weapon damage in its description, it isn't. It is one of the wrong texts in the game. Just to point that out here as well, if you're confused about that. Strikers is its own separate multiplier. That's also why it's getting done like that here, where it's its own little area over there. And we see that as well from the results that we get here, because of course we have checking numbers. I've checked those in game to make sure that they align. And the Overwatch is here with a chest striker, for instance, or other builds that, for instance, don't have any total weapon damage in them, would benefit quite a bit more. So for instance, as well, if we're running glass, let's say if our allies alongside of us were running glass, they also would, for instance, get these bonuses if it's for, different builds or such, or even in striker running glass, or if they were running spotter or such, they would get the full 14%. But we can see that the difference between those isn't, well, it isn't tiny and it isn't too large. A 2.7% difference there, 2.71% difference between the two in the game. That does matter, but it's also not completely worth redoing the build for or such. But it is important to understand that, that Overwatch is definitely, from a damage perspective alone, definitely a better pick overall. Let's go look at this now. If we actually combine the forces together and kind of look at it from a group DPS perspective. And for that, we'll come to this last one down here, where we're taking theoretical numbers and making them even more theoretically, but just from a perspective of figuring out how much could it add in perfect conditions if every 100% uptime and such, which of course, again, take all of these numbers in gameplay with a heavy grain of salt. I feel boulder-sized grain of salt, because it is also very reliant, and we'll look at that in the gameplay side of things. For instance, yeah, with the beacon, on the proximity, on the overwatches, on uptime, on the player that is running it, and such as how much they're in cover and such. But here we're taking it and looking at it in a group DPS form. So here we have 4, those striker overdogs with the equalizer chest, overdogs, no buffs to them, just 4 of them just together, outputting their full burst DPS and such. Of course, we're ignoring things like uptime and enemy availability and stuff like that. If they are the 100% point, what would be the amount that we get from 3 of those with the beacon buff, as we saw them upstairs a second ago, and then that's 1 striker running the beacon, because they need to be there, of course. So basically everybody's bunched together, they're shooting out and hitting 100% of the time and such. What do we get? And just from a perspective of comparing their DPSs, of course, we can see that actually because of the beacon, the player that is running that build is of course losing about 20%. They almost make up for it all the way, and we get back to 100% on the burst because of that 30% crit damage that they're providing to the other players. On the sustain end, actually does a little bit better. On the damage per mag, it actually does a little bit better. And that's just because of the one difference of going from a unit piece, because that beacon is, of course, running Cheska plus the beacon, and they have better damage per mag versus a unit piece there. This means that actually for a 4-man team, and this is usually the case with these, from a damage perspective, again, purely from a damage perspective, even in perfect situations, it wouldn't make up for the damage lost on the player that loses that damage just from a weapon damage perspective. Now, of course, what we also have is we have also some haste or skill efficiency there, giving us some haste, giving us some skill damage, giving us some skill health and such. And of course, we have 2% regen for anybody that is close enough to us. But if we look at it from a perspective again as well, Overwatch coming in there, and this is again why Overwatch overall from a damage perspective makes a little bit more sense for me, especially as well, because Overwatch actually is decent already. In an 8-man team, quite often people don't, but in an 8-man team, especially for raids and such, it behooves somebody to run a Ferocious Calm over an Obliterate chest if they are doing that, and gaining the team a lot more damage. And we see that here as well with the Overwatch chest, the perfect Overwatch setup. And basically, yeah, in the same way, here 3 of the normal strikers being buffed by Overwatch, that's the numbers that we had upstairs, and then 1 striker set up to have Overwatch. One of the big reasons as well that this is higher is that with the Overwatch one, we of course also could take Overdogs alongside of the Overwatch. And that totally will not mess me up every time that I try to think about it. Overdogs, Overwatch, which one was it again? But here with Overwatch, we can run Overdogs alongside of it on the player that is running that build. So that helps quite a bit as well to push this number a little bit higher. Then what we can look at as well, and that's the place, of course, where group buffs builds are actually a lot more attractive, is once we go 8-man. Now, of course, Countdown, raids and such, especially for instance in Countdown, one of my go-tos is Ongoing Directive. If there isn't an Ongoing Directive in the team, I will put the one in there, because when those kind of builds, instead of buffing just 4 people, are buffing 8 people, they become much more effective. Here we see the same. 8, basically strikers, overdogs, equalizer, no buffs from outside. If they are our 100% point, our baseline, then if we take 7 of those, and then with the beacon buff on all 7 of those, and then 1 person running the beacon, providing the buff to all, they are actually now a little bit ahead by just a little bit under 5%, well, 4.5% there. And this is then again, though, theoreticals and such in the perfect situations. You're never going to actually reach this number, especially here where you need to be all close. And getting all 8 people bunched up together, well, first of all, is a good way of getting grenaded, but also it's just not going to happen, especially in Countdown where people want to run around. But even think of some of the raid fights. In some of them you could, but in a lot of them also you couldn't. For instance, Razorback, where it needs the team to be split up and spread around. And there, Overwatch could be on one person, providing the buff without ranges and such to everybody. But this beacon can't. And that's then, again, on the inverse side of it, the beacon can also provide 2% regen, and the Overdogs or the Overwatch can't. But then, yeah, if we compare that as well, again, the same way, those strikers, but now buffed by Overwatch with one person running Overwatch, perfect Overwatch, they are still, of course, ahead. Now, this kind of illustrates as well that this buff-in builds, especially in 4-man teams, they quite often don't provide actually as much back as they take away from a group DPS perspective. But of course, not all things are always equal. So for instance, if I'm in a team and I'm with much stronger players than me, for instance, if I run that build and provide buffs to allies with Overwatch and such, they can become even stronger. And if I'm not as proficient at, killing enemies and such, I can make others buff a little bit, be buffed a little bit, and then they can be stronger and carry harder, basically. So there's considerations like that to be made. And especially in a group setting as well, this regen that this beacon can provide is actually very strong. Let's actually go take this into some gameplay and look at it in actual play. And here we'll head into a Countdown, just a challenging one, mostly to just show it into gameplay a little bit. The hecticness of a Countdown is kind of going to show its benefits and also its downsides. Here I still have the gameplay audio or the NPC audio turned off because we don't hear any of that. We should actually go left to link up with our allies, but I'm just going to go right. It's fine. It's just the challenging. And yeah, we'll go, of course, after the hunters here first. Here I'm trying to what I'm going to try to do, and here at least as well, Fog of War actually makes quite a difference for Beacon, as being able to see where your allies are on the minimap is actually quite important. And yeah, they beat us to it. Even though their animation started a little later, but I will let them touch it. But trying to stay in range of multiple allies, if nothing else, I want, of course, one ally within range, so I get the bonuses. But preferably, I want as many allies within range, and then they can benefit as well. It is very reliant on how many allies we are buffing, because we're giving up quite a bit of our own damage, of course. But alongside of that damage, there are more things that are part of it. And again, the skill efficiency, the armor regen. And I feel actually the armor regen is actually the prize. At 2% armor regen, that's actually pretty strong. Let's have a peek. Is anybody else running one? No. The thing is, of course, this is kind of a group support build or piece. And this by itself can actually be, for instance, especially think of seasons of no regen and such, could actually be a differentiator, because if you can have at least a little bit of regen, that would be already, that might be worth giving up some damage for. We'll go be in the circle. These circles are the only ones where having multiple players in them does make a difference. And actually our ally being upstairs, he isn't counting for this. You need to be downstairs. As yeah, per player in the circle, it gives 5% per tick. That's also why that other one is already long done. All the other circles doesn't matter. Basically, it's only the SHD, these SHD tech caches. I also start looking for the bucks, but of course, if I'm going to go look for the bucks, although here I still have somebody in range, I'm likely not buffing too many people. I want to be actually in the middle of the pack if I can be. But here with just, yeah, 8, and I do mean 8 headless chickens, including myself. we are not going to have that happen much, of course. Intermittently, though, yeah, we might get a little bit of bonus here and there. And I think especially during extraction, and having ran this a few times, especially during extraction, it can make a difference there. Let's see what the team does actually here. Containment would be the smart choice, but lab or admin is the close choice. It's quite often people go close. But no, actually, people are going admin. That's nice. We'll quickly grab our loot because I am definitely in the market for some unit alloys. Still, of course, that's going to be the next. Well, the part 2 is going to be the next in-depth look here. Here, though, for large parts, yeah, I'm not actually within range of anybody else, and that's the thing here. So in a coordinated setting, if we can coordinate and go like, hey, it's just the 4 of us or something, let's be close to each other, let's regen together, and yeah, that could make a difference. Plus the other things alongside of it. Plus, actually, even for instance, when hives get hit or such, 15% skill efficiency, 15% excess skill haste is actually going to make that a little bit faster. Same, for instance, if people are using skills that they are actually using, like pulses, yeah, that also definitely goes well, not a lot faster, but 15 haste is basically, yeah, it's not nothing. And yeah, instant completion here on the Warhounds, of course. As it so often does. Oh, we got the chest already, so we'll head on out. Main is on the cooling tower. We'll have to deal with some steam. But yeah, with a spread out area like this, even trying to keep it up for myself is kind of hard. And that's going to be the thing that kind of kills this. Because if I wasn't running this, what I could be running is, well, either first of all, just equalizer, more damage for myself, and then also equalizer overdogs, a lot more damage for myself. Or I could be running overdogs, and I could, for instance, set up here and yeah, just take a high ground position, be in cover. I'm allowed to cover, and the buff will stay up with Overwatch. And that would be then, honestly, a better way, for instance, here. It needs to be really coordinated situations where you can bunch up all together. And honestly, that just doesn't happen often enough. Especially in general play. Now, in a mission or such, we might be closer to each other more often. But yeah, not just out here. We can see actually the regen, and the regen, of course, the way to kind of look at 2% regen is that it'll take 50 seconds to go all the way from empty all the way to full. You can basically divide, 100 seconds or 100% by, 100 seconds. 2%, of course, makes it 50 seconds. 3% makes it 33 seconds. 4% makes it 25 seconds. And each percent added definitely takes a chunk out, especially at the start. Because especially moving from 1% to 2%, because this got buffed from the PTS to the main, where they basically, took the bonuses that it had, especially on the regen and such, and doubled it. And that did make it at least a lot more viable, because I think that the PTS one definitely wasn't. There as well, it had 20 crit damage. They didn't double the crit damage as well, even though I feel that would have been okay, honestly. As this piece, yeah, the biggest issue isn't the stats that it has, because honestly, in just trying to make this work here, though, with randoms, which isn't, of course, ideal situations, but that's also, if that's the situations you find yourself in, that's the only situations that matter, of course. But yeah, trying to just get within that 10 meters is so often so painful, and you just find yourself kind of fallen behind or being just in the different corner. And of course, it depends also on who you're kind of buffing, as of course, if we're buffing stronger players, I actually should get the main chest as well. So definitely want that skill or the SHG calibration we have from there and just the loot. Especially if there's a targeted in there. And off we go. Here I am gonna, just because I want to keep up, gonna equip a quick step. I oftentimes don't run it quite literally. Because I'll be out there fast enough, quick enough most of the time to be ahead of most players anyway. Anyway, we have a close range extraction here, which makes for a really quick countdown in the end on this. And here I'm going to make a decision, even though the right side could use my help more, the left side has more people I can buff. So we'll go that way. Because here definitely we shouldn't split up kind of the way that we are, but it's kind of fine. Although, well, you usually kind of need a base of fire here. Here though, the regen on my allies, we can kind of notice who's in range and who isn't. The regen kind of going off there. It's kind of nice to just be out in the open. You don't have to think about being in cover, because I find myself quite often running Overwatch and then really having a hard time keeping the uptime on it. And when that is the case, yeah, then, because Overwatch as well, if here at least, if I am in range of my allies, we get a bonus. If I forget to be in cover, then we don't get Overwatch at all. That's going to be the real, I feel, the real decider here. I feel that that 15 or that 10 meter range on it for 15 skill efficiency, 2 regen and such, the stats are fine, but the 10 meter, but also I don't think you can push it too much further without causing issues there as well. Because currently, as well as we discussed at the start, these can stack, and that's actually currently happening, and that breaks a lot of things, because if we can have 4% regen by just 2 people running this, and also each of them giving the other 30% crit, that actually is starting to become very OP, especially once you push it to 6 or 8% regen. Yeah, it is in a realm of quite overpowered, and with the stacking of the skill efficiency and such as well. So I'm expecting that that isn't the intended case, but also if that is the intended case, then yeah, then it's super OP. So I'm hoping they don't go that route. But for what it is, yeah, it just quite often, even here, like I should be here in the middle buffing everybody, but here also this fight is kind of over. And of course the damage that I lose shouldn't be forgotten about either. It's, as we saw in the 8-man, at least it makes a little bit of sense, but even if I'm in the middle of the pack with a 4-man, we're kind of leveling out into the same damage, but of course we gain 2% regen. And that regen as well for seasons with no regen and such might be more impactful than it is now, but of course, yeah, that isn't this season. This season we have fragile armor, and honestly, you can't regen your way through that. If people armor break, if that directive is on and people armor break, yeah, that is, they have to med pack to remove that. It would be actually interesting to see if maybe, and as an idea, they could implement of taking it so that if you regen enough, maybe it might take a fragile away. But yeah, they're kind of showing the issues, but also the places where it can kind of work, where towards the end there, we did actually buff a bunch of people. And especially from a perspective of just, you know, being a group player and such, having one of these in, for instance, an 8-man can kind of make sense. As also what we can do, of course, is combine the two, as that is just the last thing I kind of want to discuss here. And that is that we can, of course, yeah, combine the two. We could have one person running beacon. Now, of course, currently we can have multiple people running beacon, assuming that isn't intended like that. If we're running, one person is running Beacon, the other is running an perfect Overwatch, and then they're buffing, for instance, in this case, as we've added in their numbers basically here, where we have a combined everybody buffing each other basically, and because of that, of course, we raise each other's stats. Now in this case, especially because we're adding onto 6, well, with the 8-man 6, with the normal 2 people, we do actually gain a little bit there. Now in the case actually in the 4-man, that's not worth it, and should kind of be obvious, because from a perspective, if there's too many buffs, but not enough people getting buffed, you will actually lose overall. As we saw, the builds themselves, if we're going even Ferocious Calm or such, drop a little bit, especially versus, for instance, Equalizer and such. If we're going to Beacon, we're dropping quite a bit because that chest talent is actually very powerful. If we're looking at it with 2 strikers that are buffed both by Beacon and Overwatch, and then 1 player running Beacon, 1 player running Overwatch, perfect Overwatch, if we compare that, basically this number is in the same range as these. We can see actually that it's kind of at a 4-man level. It is actually in between kind of what we had with the Beacon, buffing the 4-man team, buffing 3 other full strikers versus, for instance, and then halfway in between that and Overwatch, in the same way, 3 normal players, 1 Overwatch player. So that not per se still worth it, because of course you have to kind of view it from how much percent of the team are you, and as the team gets bigger, so for instance with the 8-man, if it's a 4-man team, you're a quarter of the team, you're 25% of the team. If it's an 8-man, now you're just 12.5% of the team. And we see the results here as well, is that actually in the 8-man, just because we're both, if in a theoretical sense again as well, because as we saw there in actual gameplay, keeping the buff on everybody, especially when it's just a random team, not going to happen much. But let's say we can get the team all together, and the Overwatch, of course, will apply pretty consistently, but then for the Beacon, we're kind of pooling everybody together. We're providing both buffs out to everybody. So basically a Beacon and Overwatch buffing 6 other strikers with both of their buffs and each other as well, of course. Then we see with their powers combined, we actually are gaining now quite a bit, and a significant margin. And this then is, for instance, where it could come into play, especially if you are going from a damage perspective of things, is that, yeah, if you want to do a little bit more damage as a group sense, especially in 8-man, for instance, raids and stuff, an Overwatch makes a lot of sense in there. But in the cases of a 4-man, not so much. Even, for instance, in this area, we're kind of pushing it towards, yeah, there's too many buffers and not enough people getting buffed. But as of course, just looking at it from a pure damage perspective, yeah, Overwatch would be the one to go in first. And then we could add in a Beacon if we want to add to that. I feel, though, that from a general gameplay perspective, that range is really painful, and it ends up pushing me towards other choices. And that brings us to our conclusion here then, where especially this 10-meter range is, to me, the thing that kind of doesn't doom this, but it is too inconsistent for general use. And that is quite often a nail in a coffin for several items. As if we can't just generally use it, if we just need to pull it out for very specific situations, and then even then, it's not per se significantly better than some of other choices, it will find itself kind of relegated to a B tier or a C tier where it just doesn't see much use. And I think this item is headed that way. And to no fault of its own, because honestly, its stats and such are well worth it. 2% armor regen, that's actually, I think, the one place we might find some use for it is especially in seasons with no regen. That could benefit us enough alongside of the other things where that regen will be more worthwhile. The thing is, though, that we have, for instance, just medpacks. Everybody is carrying some around, and that's just faster than just waiting for this 2% armor regen. Now, in some fights where it's a longer engagement and you can just kind of basically cover the chip damage that might happen in those fights, There, it's kind of worth it, but then you're still stuck with this 10-meter range on it. And that's why, for instance, if we kind of split it up into its parts, on that damage end, yeah, definitely Overwatch has this speed and is going to be much more consistent, especially on a capable player that's going to be in cover most of the time and will remember to keep that uptime up. Now, of course, inversely, on a less competent player, this might be easier if the other players are competent, they'll just see the icon on their bar and go like, oh, you're my new friend now, we're going to hug all the time. Because, of course, if you see somebody else running this, just get close to them, get those buffs, and yeah, even help them out, of course, as you will activate it on their end as well if you're close enough. But then especially on like the skill efficiency and the armor regen, the healing parts of this, I feel the regen is without coordination, because, for instance, we could add a bellstone piece on everybody's build, and then that 2% becomes a 3%, and that's a little bit more manageable. Or if everybody's running mementos, and we have 5% now, everybody else is running mementos, and we're making it 5% for them. Those kind of things could be worth it, but this is now pushing into heavy coordination. In just general use, I will find myself, leaning much more on med packs, and then also if we need that more healing, pushing more towards just having a dedicated healer. Even if it's not going all the way to a full healer, we can just have a combat medic in there, or Redify, or things like that will heal enough to, for instance, offset no regen, but actually still themselves be quite capable and be able to actually heal much more predictably and more powerfully than this. And that's why I think this item, while it is actually interesting and definitely worth running, because one of the things I will want to point out here is this is still, as an item, much more useful than some of the other items that people tend to run to kind of be helpful to the team. As for instance, if we compare this to a tardigrade, I would take this 10 out of 10 times over a tardigrade. That bonus armor is usually just very limited time. It won't really save you. It doesn't, for instance, underneath it, it just might buy you some time to heal up. But if you're getting health gated, like that 10 seconds of extra bonus armor really doesn't make that difference. This, though, at least, if you are getting close to them, you're getting that critical hit damage, you're getting that armor regen, and that can help out much more than, for instance, an item like that. But yeah, it is definitely one of those items that is kind of in the lower tiers, and because of that, it just, while it does enough, I don't think they can also push it too much further than what they have here without it then becoming overpowered, because in the right situations, it is worth running. And as we saw, especially if we're combining, for instance, Overwatch together with this, then we can really push up some high numbers. And for a coordinated raid team, that might be a way to kind of set this up. But for general use, I find myself just getting frustrated with the 10 meters, and if I want to buff the team, I would give up the regen side of things and just take that Overwatch here. But yeah, that brings us to the end of this video, looking in depth into the beacon, or, well, that's also why we are out here, as we tend to call it, the bacon. As it is an interesting item. It is worth at least messing around with, but I don't think, as some items do, that I'll find myself using it too much in the future. If you did find this video informative or enjoyable in any way, please do any and all of the algorithm things down below. It does help out. So that little bit of shilling here, as we'll in the future go, of course, into that second part of unit alloys. And I'm kind of spooling up as well towards a tipping scales build showcase, although that's likely a week or two away still, but definitely on the horizon. And we'll, of course, go into the other items as well, into the bittersweet, into the concentrated company, and have an in-depth look all over the place. So yeah, I hope you join me for those. And as always, have a good night.